And I just want to thank everyone so much for tuning into our show today, because this is what it's all about. It's about getting people educated and knowledgeable on what the heck is going on. You're probably not even hearing this on television, because you hear, all you do is hear that there is a big problem with Zika and these other things that are actually non-existent. I have not found one single reference. That's something I'd like to ask Stephanie, Dr. Seneff, who is joining us today, but she's also going to be telling us more about her latest research and what she has discovered glyphosate is actually doing in our bodies, and how can we protect our families if we don't have the knowledge of what's really going on. And that's why we have Dr. Seneff on our show, and she is volunteering our time to join us here today, and we can't even tell you how much we appreciate that. So Dr. Seneff, are you there?
I am.
You know, fossil fuels are a big problem when it comes to global warming. And did you hear, Dr. Seneff, about how this giant glacier in Greenland now has a crack through the center of it?
I did. I heard that on the news here just a few minutes ago.
Oh,
Amazing,
just a few
huh?
minutes ago. It's funny, I should say that. Yeah, I actually put that on Twitter, and there's a Greenland group like they liked my tweet because I mentioned that. Because, you know, I mean, what do you think when you hear that?
Me, I mean, I'm very concerned about global climate change. That's right up there with the poison that's going on with glyphosate. And in fact, I think glyphosate is a major contributor to the problem. It's an underappreciated component of the issue because it destroys the soil bacteria that normally would fixate carbon and nitrogen into the soil. So more of the carbon and nitrogen escape as greenhouse gases because of the inefficiency of the soil bacteria. So I think glyphosate is a major contributor. Exactly what percentage, I don't know, but I suspect a lot more than what they're thinking.
Well, the Rodale Institute, that has done extensive research, like something like over 30 years of research, agree with you. And they say that is a big part of the problem. There's special fungi that absorbs carbon from the air and locks it into the soil, that 90% of it we've destroyed.
Yeah.
And we know that glyphosate is a great killer, so I'm no doubt that it's been a big part of it. But also that organic farming is one of the fastest, biggest solutions that we could possibly have, because of the amount of credits of oil that we've already said we're going to use. You know, 10, 20 years from now, we're still going to be using massive amounts of oil. So what can we do today, right now? And that is to start supporting organic farmers transitioning to organic, because that's a tough thing to do. But we've had some really great guests with some solutions for that. But
that is so important. And in fact, you know, organic farming not only arrests global warming, but it can actually reverse it, which is so important because it can bring the nitrogen and carbon back into the soil and reverse global warming.
Yes, and like just think about that for a minute. When we think about bringing it from the air into the soil, that means that we don't have to add all of these extra fertilizers that cost farmers a lot of money.
Right, exactly. They have to use so many more nitrates and phosphates because of the inefficiencies of the microbes that usually would fixate the nitrogen, you know, at the roots. It's not working properly, so they have to add more, and that's why they get these nitrates getting released. The nitrous oxide is over 100 times more effective as a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide.
Really? 100 times? Wow. So we're just accelerating by like exponentially with what we're doing here with this type of farming, where we're dependent. We pretty much become dependent on glyphosate, haven't we, Dr. Seneff?
It's so crazy. I mean, it's really ironic that we are, you know, so convinced that we have to use these toxic chemicals on our food in order to feed the world, and that is simply not true. That's a myth. And certainly, you know, for most of the history of mankind, we've been able to eat without having to use toxic chemicals. You know, this whole concept of poisoning the weeds is really very, very new in human history. And we're in a giant experiment right now. I predict that sometime soon in the future, they're going to recognize that this method is simply not feasible. And there's so much bad about it that they're going to basically give up on it completely and go completely back to organic. I'm hoping that's true. We see a lot of farms failing now because the weeds outsmart the glyphosate. You know, you poison the weed. When you poison the weed through several generations, it can evolve itself to resist the glyphosate. And this is why they've had to use more and more every year. Glyphosate usage has gone up exponentially over the past 2 decades, in step with the exponential growth in a long list of debilitating diseases. And I think it's a direct hit. I think it's a direct cause and effect relationship.
Well, and from what I'm hearing you're saying, it's like we're pretty much poisoning our population, and as a result of that, all of these different diseases are starting to skyrocket at the same time. And we
Yes.
never saw this before, right? We never saw this kind of a skyrocketing of these different diseases.
Yeah, they're all getting completely out of hand now, and you just hear so many people suffering from various autoimmune diseases, you know, and agonizing pain. They're on opioid drugs. We've got an epidemic in opioid drug painkillers and death, you know, due to overdose. It's the highest it's ever been. And people are taking heroin and morphine, I mean, anything they can take to try to beat the pain. I don't blame them, but they're killing themselves with it, you know, and if they knew they could just eat organic food and get rid of that pain,
Just get
they
off
would
the
do it.
glyphosate.
Yeah, the glyphosate's
Get off the
feeding the pain.
glyphosate, you can get off the drugs and actually have a good quality of life and live without pain anymore. I know that we've talked about thyroid issues before, and we're going to be also talking about some other issues like kidney disease and gout and what was the other one I wanted to talk about?
Anencephaly.
The what?
Was it anencephaly? Did I mention that to you?
Oh,
Or
no,
maybe not.
no, no. So we're going to be talking about that too, I guess.
Well, we could. We'll see where it goes. But
No,
I
no,
mean,
I
I
want
just
to
sent you
talk
that.
about that. Why don't we just start there? Go ahead and talk, because I
Okay,
don't
because
think
that's
we
what
have
I've
talked
been.
about that, and if that might be some of the new things that you've learned, because I know you've
It
been
is.
doing
That's I'm working very. Yeah, I'm
a lot
working.
more
I'm
research.
really researching that right now. That's hopefully going to be a new paper. So far, it's just a bunch of reading and studying and correlating and trying to figure things out. But I was when I first heard about the anencephaly epidemic in Yakima, Washington, I thought of glyphosate immediately. And then Don Huber did too, and I later shared information with him, and he did some research, and he showed, and in fact, I've investigated to confirm it, that they have, in this area where they have an epidemic in anencephaly, which is basically a baby born without a brain, no cerebral cortex. They just have the brain stem. And obviously, they're not viable. I mean, they die usually with either at birth or within a few days or weeks of birth. Um,
But the fact that they can even live at all without a brain is like blowing me away right
it's
now.
it's amazing, isn't it? And they're essentially in a coma. I mean, they don't really, you know, they don't have consciousness. It's just a brainstem that manages to keep them going. It's really very disturbing to think about this, but I mean, what a tragedy for the family. But it turns out to be extremely interesting. The science, I mean, all of the science behind the glyphosate connections with all of these diseases is just so fascinating. And so it's just, we're working it out. And of course, there's a folate problem, and folate deficiency is a direct tie-in to neural tube defects in general. And it's interesting to look at folate because the government introduced a requirement of a fortification, a folic acid fortification in wheat-based products back in 1998, really at the same time as they introduced the GMO Roundup Ready crops. I don't know if it's coincidence or whether they were observing that the incidence of neural tube defects was going up or what, but it feels almost like they knew that glyphosate would cause this, which makes sense because folate is a direct derivative of the shikimate pathway, which is the pathway that glyphosate disrupts. Disrupts that in plants, it disrupts it in microbes, and we depend on our gut microbes to produce those shikimate pathway products, which then become, and also to produce the folate. The microbes produce the folate for us. And when they are exposed to glyphosate, they can't. And so you get this folate deficiency problem, which is a direct hit on anencephaly.
Well, from what I hear you're saying is we're so like let's just like picture um, crops out there on the farm. And so the soil, which is supposed to have all these microbes that you just said create great things like folic acid, that the microbes will actually do that, that we then come and we spray Roundup to kill the weeds, but the food crop is growing right there in the same place. And so once we spray that Roundup on the soil, uh, where the crop is also located, you're saying that it's killing these microbes that make the folic acid that prevents this anencephaly. Is it anencephaly?
And yeah, anencephaly, but it's actually killing the microbes in our own gut. The glyphosate that we're getting in our food is disrupting the microbes in our gut ability to make the folic acid for us. And actually, they make folate, and folic acid are very different. And folic acid is actually a very unhealthy form of folate. It turns out to be what they're putting into the wheat because it's cheaper and because it doesn't break down as easily. So they're thinking it's a better, if you bake a cake or something, you could destroy it all. So they decided they wanted to do folic acid instead of folate, which was also a very, very bad idea because the gut microbes can't fix the folic acid. So it ends up going to the liver. And in order for the liver to convert the folic acid into the form that the body needs, it has to consume its methylation capacity and also consume its antioxidant capacity. So it's going to hurt glutathione in the liver. It's going to hurt the body's ability to have enough methylation capacity, which is another critical thing associated with autism. Hypomethylation is a factor in autism. So, and also the low glutathione is a factor in autism. So we're getting all this folic acid in the bread. I think this might be contributing to the gluten intolerance problem. I think the glyphosate is definitely a contributor, probably the most important one, to the epidemic we're seeing in gluten intolerance. But the folic acid may also be playing a role. In fact, a lot of people have said to me that when they go to Europe, they can eat the bread. And Europeans never passed a law requiring folic acid. They are against it. They are actively against putting folic acid in the bread. And I think they're very wise not to do it.
So this folic acid that is in the bread isn't the same as the folic acid that we get in food.
It's folate versus folic acid. And, I see people, even researchers writing papers, they mix up those two terms. They use them interchangeably, folic acid and folate. And they are very different. And folate is the healthy form that the microbes produce. And folic acid is the unhealthy form that's in the bread.
Well, and so what you're saying is that that because we're taking this other form that isn't the form that we would naturally get in food, this synthetic form, that there's a compromise to ingesting this, that we have to lose. It's so hard for the body to process it in the liver
Yes.
that we lose other energy that we could be using, and enzymes, like you said, the glutathione in this, we're losing that to this process of trying to
Yes.
create this folic acid that the body desperately needs. And so we end up with a deficit in something else that's critical for our body to protect itself and to function correctly.
Yeah, and then more interesting than that is that if the liver finally gets so exhausted with trying to fix all this folic acid that's coming at it, it can decide to just take a pass. And that allows this folic acid to get into the blood untransformed. And so when that happens, the folic acid actually binds to the folate receptors in the brain and disables them. So the actual result is that you have brain folate deficiency as a consequence of too much folic acid. And people, they're telling women to take, folic acid supplements throughout pregnancy. And then women are also eating this bread that's got this fortification folic acid. I think it's actually working against them. It's really ironic because there is a folate deficiency problem, but the folic acid is not fixing it, and it may even be making it worse. And it leads to both autism and various developmental problems in the fetus having to do with the neural tube, which includes anencephaly, also microcephaly, which is just a small brain, not quite as bad, and other kinds of things like spina bifida. All these neural tube defect problems are directly connected to folate deficiency.
And you're saying that because the glyphosate is killing the gut bacteria, as
Yes.
well as limiting the killing the microbes in the soil that make the food form of
Yes,
folic
right.
acid, which is perfect, that is the beginning of this problem. So explain to us what is happening to our babies. Like let's just start with, you know, we'll kind of skip over conception, but you have a baby growing inside of the mother, and how is the baby's gut being affected from the very beginning?
Well, it depends on the extent to which the mom has been exposed to glyphosate, because if you get a lot of exposure, it sets up leaky barriers, starting with the leaky gut barrier. And once you have a leaky gut barrier, that introduces a leaky brain barrier. And so then if you're pregnant, you end up with a leaky placental barrier. And that's when you get into really a lot of trouble because not just the glyphosate gets into the fetus, but also the toxic metals. And then the fetus can have a leaky brain barrier too. So all the barriers are leaky and the nasty stuff is getting into the fetal brain. And of course, even when the fetus, before there's a brain at all, those very early stages, really just in, I think, like the first month of the development that neural tube closure takes place. And when that doesn't work properly, that's when you get all these issues with development that are so catastrophic.
So, and the baby, so it depends on how much glyphosate that the mother is ingesting. So, when does a baby actually start creating gut bacteria?
Well, that's interesting. It was long thought that the environment was sterile in the placenta, that there were no microbes there. For a long time, we thought that. So the baby actually doesn't have, its gut is not really particularly populated with microbes until it goes through the birth canal. That's when it picks up huge numbers of microbes from its mom, and starts to colonize its own gut. So really, in the first year of life is a really important time for the baby's gut to get on track. And one of the interesting things is that babies that are born through C-section actually have a higher risk to autism. And I think that's directly because of their lack of having gone through the birth canal. They didn't pick up those microbes. And so they get a strange set of microbes that starts them off. And then it really is so important to get those microbes growing properly early in life for everything else to follow.
And so if to me it's kind of a double whammy if there's a C-section and then no breastfeeding.
Exactly. That is really, really hard for the child because the breast milk is another way that the breast milk nourishes the microbes. It's actually part of its content is designed to feed them, to feed the microbes. Some of the foods, the contents of the breast milk is not digestible by the human digestive system, but the microbes digest it and the milk helps them to mature and grow properly. And so you cannot replace breast milk with any kind of a formula that could be at all comparable. There's so much that you're missing when you feed a baby a formula instead of breast milk.
Well, to me, breast milk is the greatest gift you can give your child. And now,
Absolutely,
now,
I
now
agree.
I'm thinking like if you can avoid a C-section, I realize I actually had someone kind of jump on me like, if it wasn't for a C-section, my babies and I would have been at risk. And I am never saying that under an emergency situation to save the life of the baby or the mom or both, that a C-section would not be warranted. But what I am saying is I've read the statistics, and there are unnecessary C-sections that happen. There are even uh, mothers that will choose to have a C-section at a certain date that
Right.
fits in their schedule, or because they don't want to stretch out their vagina, which I mean,
I know it's
and
it's it's
it blows
amazing.
my mind. If you choose to have a baby, I would think you would want to have a healthy baby because having an autistic child, I mean that to me is way more involved um, than not meeting your schedule or if that's what you're worried about, go have it tightened up later on or something.
And childbirth is one of the most miraculous things you can experience. It's really the most incredible thing you'll experience in your life, I think.
Well, I had
Really,
both mine at home with a midwife and no drugs. And so
I did that too with my last
oh,
two.
did
So
you?
I
Right
did, yes.
on.
And I had all of mine with no drugs, but the last two were at home with midwives.
And what did I mean, to me, it was the most empowering experience of my life. And I feel like women are being robbed of it or told
I
that they're
agree.
weak and that they have to have an epidural and all these other things when actually it was empowering to me. I just feel like, man, I could do that. I can do anything.
I know it is. It's such an incredible experience too. The whole process, is just unbelievable. And the idea of just knocking yourself out. Some women really like the idea, just knock me out and wake me up when it's over. They don't want to experience it. And
I
it's
wanted to
really the
experience
best.
every second of it, every bit of the
I did
pain.
too.
And
Yeah, it was really amazing. Yeah.
I had an out of body experience. I swear I could actually, like, I was looking down and seeing myself.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was like because your body makes these really cool drugs by itself, right?
I know.
When
It
you
is
let
really
it.
truly amazing. And it's curious. I mean, now we have such a high C-section rate in this country. It just cannot be possible that many pregnancies are are so compromised that the normal process is no longer working. I mean, what is the matter with us? It could be that somehow all the poisons in our environment are actually, I would not be surprised, are messing up our ability to actually carry out a normal birth, you know?
Oh yeah, I wouldn't doubt that. But I also, from the experience that I had where I was in a relaxed situation, because when you think about it, babies are like the one healthy patient normally, and
Yes.
they're the healthiest, usually the healthiest group. And why expose them? Because there's special bacteria and viruses that are developed in the hospital that are.
I know. That's
And
scary to
there's a
see
name for
that.
that, and it kind of escapes me right now, but there's actually a name for those bacteria and viruses that develop in the hospital. And I thought, why expose my baby to
Right.
that situation when I didn't have to?
And you also expose it to the out of control situation with with a doctor. Once the doctor's there, he just takes control of your pregnancy, and you no longer are, in charge of your own childbirth.
It's
The
so
doctor
funny
is
you
going
should mention
to
that, Dr. Seneff, because I had a woman share with me an experience where she had had previous children. She knew she was fine, and the doctor insisted that she had to have a C-section, and she was literally screaming in the gurney down the hallway as they wheeled her to do that to her. And she was like, "I don't want this. I don't want this."
yeah.
And I just found that whole situation very upsetting. And the other thing I wanted to mention was when you're in a relaxed situation, at least with my experience, there's childbirth has this rhythm that
Hmm.
happens. You can feel it when the contractions come, and those contractions are like the weirdest pain ever because it's like you can't touch it, you can't like try to rub it out. It's coming from deep inside. But I felt like there was this rhythm, and even after you have the baby, when the placenta comes next, for all of that to go smoothly, you have to feel relaxed. If you start
Yes.
getting tensed up, you destroy that rhythm that happens. And that's why I was
Right.
so grateful to have the experience that I did, because I could definitely feel that. And I feel my midwife was so supportive, and she'd say
Right.
things like, "You're about ready to meet your baby and see your baby's face," and just, all these great things that I feel like really supported me. And the classes that she had before that, because I
Right.
wasn't prepared, I didn't know what to expect. And she really made me feel comfortable for the whole event. But
And when you're in the hospital, you're on needles and pins all the time, so you're not relaxed. You're very tense. That's not the way to give birth to a child because you're afraid of what the doctor or the nurse is going to try to do to you all the time. You never quite know what's coming at you.
Well, I'm a little shy too, and like, having all these people that I don't know, looking at me
Right.
in that position, it's kind of like that kind of would tense me up in itself. But I just find this all fascinating about the microbes, and I'm wondering if there is, how if the mother has been compromised. You said that, the baby, the leaky gut, the leaky brain barrier, um, these things that start malfunctioning as a result of glyphosate. Like how extensive is this really? I mean, are people like sitting around not feeling really good and been going through all kinds of health problems, and it could be related to some of these things that you're talking about? And then what should a woman do, and a father as well, the parents do, if they want to conceive? I think I'd like to get some really good advice out there for people that want to conceive. Maybe they're having fertility problems, they can't get pregnant. What is your advice?
Well, it's my advice for everything, and I think it's especially important for preparing for childbirth, which is, of course, number one is to eat a 100% organic whole foods diet. So no processed foods, and no non-organic foods. Everything you buy has to be
For how
organic.
for how long before you conceive?
I mean, I would do that forever, but of course, I
Yeah,
guess you would have to. I mean, I guess I would say a year at least
yeah,
of
that's
that
what
before
that's what
you
I
can see.
say. I was curious what you
That's just
say.
a guess, but a year should be enough time to kind of clear out whatever, at least the sort of mobile glyphosate. Because your glyphosate, what happens with the glyphosate is that it accumulates. In one place, it accumulates most is in the bone marrow, which is really scary. So as you age and you accumulate more and more glyphosate from your food, it's going to increase the content over time that's in the bone marrow because it's very, very difficult to get it out. And eventually you might get something like non-Hodgkin's lymphoma or leukemia because of that, because those, those white blood cells come out of that bone marrow contaminated with glyphosate, and then they just malfunction. They get their DNA destroyed and you end up with a cancer. And those two cancers are linked to glyphosate.
And
And
and with a baby, you're creating new cells every
I know, and whenever
every
you've got,
second. You're creating new
well, one
cells.
thing really interesting is that what I highly suspect is that cells that multiply, cells that proliferate, are the ones that are especially susceptible to glyphosate poisoning. Because, and there's a reason for that. There was a wonderful study that showed that glyphosate is actually actively taken up in the mucous membranes by the cells along transporters that normally take up protein, amino acids. It's because glyphosate is an amino acid. It's an amino acid analog of glycine. Glycine is the smallest amino acid. And so the cells actually, the glyphosate actually takes advantage of the cell's own amino acid transport mechanisms to get into the cell. And so cells that are proliferating actually increase the amount of this receptor this transporter, they increase the amount that they produce when they are reproducing, because they need a lot of amino acids to reproduce. So that's going to be especially attractive to pulling in the glyphosate that's in the environment. So it's really cells that are proliferating, and that includes, of course, tumors. So tumors, I suspect, are taking up lots of glyphosate if it's in their environment.
And well, I'm curious how it affects tumors, but I always go back to my organic chemistry and think
Mm-hmm.
about mitosis. And that is, what you said, cells proliferating, dividing, multiplying. And to me, I've always thought that that is the point when you are the most vulnerable, when a cell is the most
Yeah,
vulnerable, when it is like multiplying, because it's almost like being caught with your pants down. It is like,
you're right. It's a good
the
metaphor.
most sensitive time of all. And then you think about a baby, and that's exactly what's happening. There's all kinds of mitosis, not only in the baby, but
Yes.
a small child that's growing.
Right. Well, of course, the baby, there's all that multiplication that goes on as the particular organ forms. The first thing it has to do is kind of make a lot of cells, right? That will then, evolve into the particular cells of that organ. The baby is really, the one egg is going to have to multiply a lot to become a baby, right? That makes sense that
And
the
how
infant
much
is going to be
protein is being
especially
made?
vulnerable.
Well, how much protein is being made, Dr. Seneff? Because you've been telling us that glycine, the synthetic glycine in Roundup, the glyphosate, can actually take up that glycine slot on our proteins,
Exactly.
when we think of protein in our body, what should we be thinking of? I mean, all the things that protein is
Oh,
a
so
part of.
many things. The receptors, the enzymes, the transporters, um,
The muscles.
the chelators, all kinds of things.
Yeah,
Yeah,
protein.
the muscles, of course, all the the protein, the hemoglobin in the red blood cells, and the myoglobin in the muscles, and all the muscle fibers. It's really interesting, actually. There's a protein in muscle um, that has a glycine at a particular position. So what happens is, what I've done is gone through the research literature looking for proteins that have essential glycines, which means that if you change that glycine amino acid into something else, that protein is busted. And there's a protein in the muscles called myosin, which is so fascinating. It has a glycine at position 699 in the proteins in the amino acid sequence. If you replace that glycine with alanine, which just has an extra methyl group, so just a tiny change, you completely destroy its capacity to work in its role of making the muscle contract. So this is, I think, how you could get chronic fatigue syndrome. If you just get glyphosate instead of the glycine in myosin, your muscles are going to be so weak. And that can also then lead down the road to ALS, because this is going to require that the nerves that are exciting the muscle have to work harder to try to make that muscle work, because that muscle is so defective. And then the nerves get worn out too. And once they are working harder, they're going to be pumping in more amino acids, so they're going to pull in the glyphosate. So you sort of get into a cascade situation where once a particular system is stressed, it's going to start attracting glyphosate. And that's going to make its situation worse. And
And
it's a cascade collapse.
and there are other muscle wasting diseases that I think could be greatly affected by that as well, like
Yes, I think
MS.
so.
MS is the first thing that
Well,
comes to.
MS is very interesting, because one of the things that's clear with MS is that there's an attack of the myelin sheath by the immune system. There's an autoimmune attack on the myelin sheath. Um, Anthony Sampson and I have a new paper that we've been talking about for quite some time. We're still waiting. The good news is it has finally been accepted, and we're waiting for the final proof. So we're hoping it'll come along any day now. But in this paper, we talk about the vaccines and the glyphosate contamination in the vaccines, but we also talk about multiple sclerosis. And there are many different microbes that have peptide sequences that are similar to peptide sequences in myelin basic protein. It's very interesting to me that there's this kind of intersect space between certain peptides that are in invasive, organisms that we're infected with that resemble peptides in the myelin basic protein. I don't think it's accidental. I think there's actually an underlying plan on the part of the body to attack the myelin sheath and strip it away in order to provide resources to help the blood, because the blood is under tremendous stress. So I have a kind of a generic theory that glyphosate is destroying the blood. The blood is just simply not healthy in the presence of glyphosate. It kind of ends up in a situation where there's a constant tension between hemorrhaging and blood clots. And you see that in the elderly. They're all on Coumadin. They're taking these medicines, these drugs that will try to keep them from getting blood clots, but you can end up with hemorrhaging to death. The blood is no longer able to maintain its homeostasis in the presence of glyphosate. And in order to fix that problem, what you need is sulfate. And in order to get the sulfate, you need to rob it from some organ. And one of the organs you could rob it from is the brain or the nervous system. And so in the case of multiple sclerosis, you're robbing it from the nerves, the nervous system. The
Well,
spine.
and I'm thinking about Guillain-Barré syndrome as well, which is
Yes,
more
right.
of an acute uh, kind of a sudden disease that will show up. And I'm thinking in my head, I wonder if we could look at some cases of that and see if there was some sort of an exposure to something, maybe a high dose, or maybe it was over an extended period of time. But
Yeah,
um,
I think that there's a tremendous number of proteins in a tremendous number of sources, including the food, of course, as well, and all these microbes. The multiple sclerosis is very interesting because there's a microbe called Acinetobacter. I don't, Acina, Acinetobacter, I believe that's how it's pronounced with a K, Acinetobacter, in the nose. It actually causes a runny nose, and um, and that microbe is among the very few microbes that can metabolize glyphosate. It can actually clear it. But as a consequence, it's going to be taking glyphosate up, and it's going to have the potential to end up with glyphosate in its proteins, and that microbe has been linked multiple sclerosis because of this peptide sequence similarity to the myelin sheath. So it's very, very interesting to me to think that perhaps that microbe is getting infected with glyphosate that's going into the protein and making that protein much more allergenic, because the glyphosate makes it very difficult. First of all, it makes it more abnormal, so it's more immunosensitive, immune sensitive, and then also harder to break down. So the immune cells get especially angry, when they see this protein they can't deal with. And that's what can cause them then to become hyperactive and then start attacking the myelin sheath.
well, and I'm wondering how aspartame plays in all this too, because I have heard back from people that said they were big gulp drinkers
Mm-hmm.
that have been, and they started to experience MS symptoms. So I'm
That's
wondering if
interesting.
there's an overlapping of those two things, if it's like, again, another double whammy, or if, each are doing something separately, but just accelerating the
Yeah, and
whole
maybe
process.
synergistically toxic. I would not be surprised because lots of things are synergistically toxic with each other. They work together to cause harm because one is doing something and the other one's doing something else. When you have those two things happening, it's much, much worse than having either one of them independently. This
And ha-
happens a lot.
and you've predicted like autism rates, just you're just seeing this trend of autism, which is what inspired you to start looking at glyphosate to begin with.
That's right.
So how does all this come back to autism? And also, I feel like there's a big rise in people having thyroid problems. And I did talk to one
Right.
researcher, and he's like, well, as we age, of course, it's going to the thyroid function is going to decrease. And yeah, I can accept that, but it seems like You know, when you go, I'm first of all, I'm wondering how these things are factoring into that. But I also feel like if of course that's going to be true, and so should we really be trying to get uh, a 60 or 70-year-old thyroid to work like a 20-year-old thyroid by supplementing with 50,000 units of vitamin D and synthetic thyroid hormones?
I know that's been the answer, hasn't it, to just take hormones,
Yeah,
which I think,
well,
which I'm
and like,
very
yeah,
worried
if
about.
you go get a test and you're at this certain level, no matter what age you are,
Yeah.
and not thinking, oh, well, this is a 60, 70-year-old person, so we would expect a decrease. But then, you know, maybe it's the glyphosate that's, you know,
I
causing
know.
it
I mean,
to
I think we
age
are
quicker.
starting more and more to think that old people should be disabled, and I see so many people now, it pains me so much. If I go to the airport, even at the airport, which is people who can still travel, you see a lot of wheelchairs, you see people with canes and walkers. I mean, people are really in bad shape. And and Alzheimer's, of course, is an epidemic, just like autism. That's going up exponentially as well. And we seem to be able to adjust to the new normal, where, of course, you're 67 years old. What do you expect? Of course, you're going to be weak and have sort of brain fog. That's just what it's like when you're that age. And that is simply not true. I think if you were to go back 50 years, you would be surprised at how energetic and alert the elderly were back then compared to how they are
Well, look
on
at Thomas
average today.
Jefferson and John Adams. They lived to be like in their 90s, right? And they were still
Yeah.
writing and farming and doing all kinds of things using their brain.
Right.
Um,
We just seem to be able to accept that, oh, yeah, you're getting old, so of course, you're not going to be able to think very well. I mean, we just accept it. It really annoys me that we think it's normal to fall apart because it's not. It's just not normal. And we should be much, much healthier when we're older. Of course, now we're getting those things showing up at younger and younger ages as well. We're getting rheumatoid arthritis in teenagers
oh, and
and
that's
also
such a
adult
horrible
onset
disease.
diabetes in teenagers. These diseases are just going down and down and down on the age of onset. And Alzheimer's onset is also going down.
And again, to just kind of remind everyone, glyphosate is used on the soil to kill these weeds, and in turn, it's killing all these soil microbes that help to create nutrients and uh, make them available to the food that we eat. And so there's now this deficit of nutrients in our food that are supposed to be in our food. And I'd like to ask your opinion on that. We only have a couple more minutes, but also the microcephaly. Is there any link between the anencephaly and the microcephaly?
I think they're close cousins, and I think the microcephaly in northeast Brazil is being caused mostly by all the toxic chemicals that are there. That particular area of Brazil, I've studied it quite a bit, and those people are exposed to so many toxic chemicals, including glyphosate, that it's a wonder that more of the kids aren't born with microcephaly. I mean, it's crazy to just blame it all on Zika. It's simply not true.
And there are
It's
lots of
just a
causes.
decoy. It's a
Yeah,
decoy.
well, from my understanding, there are lots of different things that can cause Zika. And even aside if someone was never exposed to Zika, 2 to 12 babies in every 10,000 are born with microcephaly that are from these various other causes.
Right.
It could be genetic, exposed to a virus or bacteria. I mean, there's so many different things. How can we totally pinpointed on this one thing, which we have no proof of, and yet we allocated $1.6
I know.
billion dollars of
It
taxpayer
was
money to
I think it was totally rigged. I think that they thought, oh, great, this is a great opportunity to get us to fund the development of a Zika vaccine, which this company that's doing it thinks they understand how to do it. The Zika vaccine is very creepy itself. I mean, I think it's really terrifying. They're going to get us all persuaded to just roll up our sleeve and get the Zika vaccine when it comes out because we're terrified of microcephaly. It's so ridiculous.
and
And they're also spraying all those, insecticides. They're spraying, mosquito
and they're
poisons to kill the
pinning it on the
mosquitoes.
Zika virus when actually, you know, it could be, if you follow it back, it could be the pesticide that is doing that. And then who's going to make money off that? Are the
I know.
taxpayers going to get a return on their 1.6 million? Oh, oh, well, thank goodness you've saved us from Zika. And like, really, how many
I know.
babies were born? You know, we already said 2 to 12 are in every 10,000 are getting it outside of Zika. So
Right.
this, yeah, it's just it's a way that corporate is ripping off the taxpayers
It's amazing how
legally.
well it works to sort of work that fear angle, you know? It's just amazing. Once you get an idea in somebody's head that, oh my God, I'm going to be bitten by a mosquito, my kid's going to have microcephaly, that's so terrifying. I better get this vaccine. You know, it's just like, it works like a charm. It's just amazing how gullible people are to think, oh, I've got to get this.
And well, that's why having you on this show today is so awesome, Dr. Seneff, because the way that you explain everything to us, it's so easy to understand. And like I said earlier today, I believe that knowledge is the best way for us to protect our families.
Absolutely.
We
Yeah,
can't,
people need to educate themselves and then make their own informed decisions about these things, you know. And I really think the best you can do is to eat organic. And also, we didn't mention this, but of course, eating probiotic foods, naturally fermented foods are really healthy because they can help to renew your gut microbes.
and so I would think that, a pregnant woman, well, what if they're not breastfeeding? I really wish that all mothers would breastfeed.
Absolutely. It's very, very important to breastfeed your baby. If you want a healthy child, you absolutely have to do that.
But if you're going to use a formula, please, again, like just like you said, Dr. Seneff, right? Organic. I mean,
Yeah, I mean,
even if,
organic soy formula is very expensive, unfortunately, and it's kind of ridiculous that you would think that the government would work hard to make that available for the babies that can't breastfeed for one reason or another because it's so important. If you're taking a non-organic soy formula and soy is GMO Roundup ready, that's just really scary to think
I
about, you
know
know.
the baby, you think about this tiny little baby and how all these different ways that they're getting exposed to glyphosate through the vaccines, just through the whole development process in the mother. And then to compound that with formula. But even mothers that are eating non-organic foods can still be the glyphosate and can still be going through the breast milk. We know that as well.
Absolutely. That's right.
So there are all those different ways. Well, I really thank you so much, Dr.
Thank
This
you.
is like been so incredible today. These are just things that I've been wanting to discuss because young parents are really a priority for me. People trying to have a baby, and I do also encourage birth control. We that's how we prevent unwanted pregnancies and an IUD without hormones, because those are the ones that have that are synthetic hormones that who knows. I've heard really negative things about that. But that's one way to totally avoid having to take any hormones. And again, we don't know long term how that can affect when you decide you want to have a baby,
Right.
especially the way that they're making them now. But I want to thank everyone for tuning in to Smart Health Talk, and I hope you're more knowledgeable today. Thanks to Dr. Stephanie Seneff. And please join us next Tuesday at 4 o'clock our new time. And this podcast and video is up on the KCAA website right now. So please share it and tell your friends where to go and watch this.
KCAA Loma Linda.